Your Friday Pattern Company, and this is the Davenport Dress Sew Along. So in this video, we will be taking you step by step through the construction of the Davenport dress. This video is meant to accompany the instructions that came with the pattern, so you should have your pattern and you should have your pattern pieces cut out already. That's where we'll start in this video. And then, yeah, we'll just go step by step and give you some fun tips and tricks along the way. I hope that you enjoy it. This is, well, spoiler alert, this is the Davenport dress that I make. So this fabric is it's 100% linen. I got it at my local shop that is not online, but I will put a link down below for a couple shops that I like that carry linens if you want a linen. So this is kind of just like a warm stone color, which is, I don't want to call it a plain fabric, but it's a simple fabric, and I chose it so that you could really see the style lines. But I also think that this dress can be made from these more basic fabrics and look cool because it's got a lot of style going on with the way, like all of the little details. So yeah, I really love how it turned out, and I can't wait for you to see the sew along. So let's get started. Before we get started, let's quickly go over the materials you'll need. So here I have instructions printed out. I have my clips or pins. I have some matching thread. This is 3/8 inch wide elastic that you need a yard of, and I have a seam gauge, or just a ruler will work. Scissors. I've got a safety pin. We'll be using this a lot. And then I have my pieces all cut out, and then each of the notches I've snipped in 1/4 inch, and those are just reference points that you'll need when assembling the pattern. We'll start with the drawstring. So grab your 2 drawstring pieces and pin them together, right sides together along this short edge, and then you'll just stitch using your 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now I have those 2 drawstring pieces sewn together and that seam pressed open. I'm going to fold the drawstring in half lengthwise, right sides together, and use a 1/4 inch seam allowance to stitch all the way down to the end, making a long tube. Now that we have our drawstring stitched into a tube, we gotta turn it right side out. So grab your safety pin and pin it to the end of your drawstring, and then we will slide the safety pin back into the tube and then just slowly inch our way down. So when you first start, you have to do a little picking to get it started, and then just scooch it and pull and scooch and pull. And it is a little bit tedious, but once you get used to turning tubes, it becomes second nature. So pull all the way to the end until the safety pin comes out the other side, and then you'll turn it completely right side out and then just press it flat. Once you finish your drawstring, set it aside and we'll get started on the bodice. Grab your neckline facing C, and we're going to finish this lower curve. I have some double fold bias tape, so I wanted to just finish it with that, just to use it up and also to add a little pop of color on the inside. So I'm just going to encase that lower edge. You could do a zigzag stitch or whatever you want to use for a seam finish. So I'm at the machine just wrapping the bias tape around that lower edge of the neckline facing and then edge stitching it in place. Once you have your facing finished, you'll grab your your bodice front A, and then you will pin your neckline facing right sides together on the bodice along that neckline, and then you will sew that with your 3/8 inch seam allowance. That is finished. Now we're going to clip this curve and then we'll flip it right side out. So to clip the curve, you just trim into the seam allowance towards the seam and without trimming through it. And you can just clip every inch or so. And this will make it so that our curve can lay flat when we flip it around. Then you'll flip your facing to the wrong side of your bodice and give it a good press. Now you want to pin this in place, and you're going to take it back to your machine and stitch 1/4 inch from the edge of your neckline facing around to make a tube for our elastic to go through. Here's that finished. So now you're going to grab your elastic, and if you haven't already, you want to cut your length of neckline elastic. In the instructions, we have a suggestion for the length that each size should cut for their neckline. So I have that cut, and then I'm just going to grab a safety pin and clip it on, I guess pin it, onto the end, and then we are going to run it through this tube that we've created. So just stick your safety pin with your elastic on it in one side of this tube and start inching it through. When you get close to, when the edge of your elastic starts to get close to the opening of the tube, grab a pin and stick it in because otherwise it'll just pull right through since the neckline is larger than the length of the elastic. Just to secure that in place before we baste it shut. And then you pull it through the other side and you'll add a pin there as well. Then you'll take this over to your machine and baste the two sides of the tube shut, catching the elastic in your stitch. And here's what that looks like done. Now we'll grab our front yoke pieces and sew them right sides together along the curved neckline edge. So that's this curved edge. You can see it's not this straight diagonal one has a notch on it, and then the shorter straight one is the shoulder. So just this curved edge, 3/8 of an inch. And then once you have that sewn, you're just going to clip this curved edge just like you did with the neckline before. And you're going to repeat on both sets. So you have 2 sets. You have 4 yokes total, 2 sets. Now we'll join the front bodice to those front yokes that we've assembled. So we still have them right sides together. Our neckline's clipped and we are going to wrap it around the straight diagonal edge on the front bodice. We're going to match the seams up at the top and pin that in place. Just scooch gathers away if they are in the seam allowance where you're going to sew, and then you'll match up these notches, and then you will sew this using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way down, and you're going to be sewing through 3 layers. So 2 layers of yoke, 1 layer of bodice. And repeat on both sides. Here I have both of those done, and we're just going to do a little clipping and trimming. So first things first, we're going to clip this corner. After you clip the corner, you can trim the edges, and then we're going to grade the seam. So grading the seam is basically if your seam is going to be thick and create a ridge, you'll cut the different layers of it down to different, trim your seam allowance down to different lengths so that it creates a smoother edge and you don't have a thick layer. This is a little bit awkward to film because I'm at a weird angle, but basically you're going to cut the seam allowance that's going to sit closest to the face down the shortest. So that would be the right side, and you're going to trim that down to 1/8 of an inch. And then the layers behind can be 1/4 of an inch. Now, this is what those duckbill scissors are for. I've never gotten a pair because there's never lefties in shops. And so I should just special order some, but I've honestly never used them. You just have to be careful here not to cut anything that's not supposed to be cut. Once you have everything trimmed and clipped, you can pull it right side out and give it a press and repeat on both sides. Here's what that looks like finished. So cute. Moving right along to the back, we're going to grab our 2 back yoke E pieces and pin them right sides together and sew around the neckline using our 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once you have that done, you can go ahead and clip this curve, which you already know how to do. Now we're going to join our front bodice to our back yoke. So grab your back yoke that you just clipped the curve on, and we're going to wrap the shoulder seams around the front. This is kind of reminiscent to how we joined the front yoke to the front bodice. So we're just gonna match up those seams at the corner, and then we're gonna sew this using our 3/8 inch seam allowance and repeat on both sides. And here that is sewn up. So all we've got to do is clip the corners and grade the seams like we did before. And we'll repeat that on both sides, and then we're ready to get started with the rest of the bodice back. Grab your bodice back D, and we're going to sew gathering stitches along this top edge between these notches. So you do that by using a long straight stitch. I like to just make it 5 millimeters long, which is as long as my machine will go, and you sew 1/4 inch from the edge of the fabric, and then you sew another parallel to that seam just 1/4 inch away. Okay, it's time to join the back bodice D to our back yoke. So we're gonna lay our project out right side facing up, and then grab the back bodice D that you just sewed the gathering stitches on and lay that right sides together face down on your project. And then you'll start to pin it in place through 1 layer of your back yoke, just that upper layer. So not the bottom one. and you'll pin that in place. You can start at the edge and then pin over to where your gathering stitches start, and then you can repeat that starting from the other side. So pin that edge in place, matching up the edges, and then pin to the yoke. After that, we'll pull on the gathering stitches until the back bodice matches the length of the back yoke. So we just need to gather it in, and that's why we have those stitches. Once you have it gathered into the length that you want, you can distribute the gathers, just move them around until they look even to you. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you know, just get it looking nice. And then we'll take that to the sewing machine and sew across this seam using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we're gonna join the back yokes so that we have a fully encased seam allowance here. That's why you left that one side of the back yoke loose. So this is commonly referred to as the Burrito Method. It is a somewhat common sewing technique. So basically lay your project right side facing up and then roll the front of your bodice back so that it sits on top of that back yoke. And then you're gonna do the same with the back. You're gonna roll it up towards the back yoke and have it sit on the back yoke so that you can see that seam that you just sewed. And then you're gonna flip the free yoke, back yoke, over so that it matches up with the other back yoke and they're right sides together. And then you're gonna pin that in place and sew it using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So you can see here that you've got your shoulder seam up here, you've got your neckline seam, and it's a little bit confusing to look at, but once you get it right, you can sew this and it's a really nice finish. So just match up the raw edge, pin across, and then use the 3/8 inch seam allowance. Here we have that sewn, and to flip it right side out, we're just gonna pull it through one side of the yoke, and magically we'll just have this beautiful bodice with all enclosed seam allowances. Now you can take this over to your iron, give it a good press, and remove any visible gathering stitches that were left behind outside the seam allowance. Alrighty, time to get our flutters ready. So grab your flutter sleeve F, and we are going to fold the lower straight edge under a 1/4 inch towards the wrong side and press it, and then we'll fold it under another 1/4 inch to the wrong side and press it, and then we will edge stitch that in place, and you'll repeat on both flutter sleeves. And here that is finished. Next up, we're gonna add gathering stitches across the top of our flutter. So that'll be the same as we did on our back bodice. So you'll just add 2 lines of long straight stitches. And here that is finished. Now we sew our little flutter to our bodice. So lay your bodice out right side up and pin your flutter sleeve to it right sides together. So we're matching notches to start. We've got notches on the front and the back that we can match up with, and then the end of the flutter kind of matches up with the bottom of the yoke. And then we'll go ahead and gather in the rest of the flutter sleeve the way that we did this technique already on the back yoke. So just pull it in and then distribute the gathers evenly. You can concentrate your gathers up towards the shoulder for a more like peaked like wing, or you can kind of spread them out a little bit more and get like a more subtle, I mean, this flutter sleeve is not subtle, but you know, get like a flutter that maybe lays a little bit flatter. Anyway, once you've got your flutter how you want it, take it over to the sewing machine and we're gonna baste this in place, and we'll repeat that on both sides. And here she is in all her fluttery glory. We're gonna do a little pre-pressing on our sleeve hem before we sew it in to make it easier for when we do hem it. So grab your seam gauge. We're going to turn the hem edge under 1/4 of an inch and give it a good old press. After you've got that press, you'll turn it under again at the notches and give that a good old press. And then we'll use these creases as reference points later. You'll see. All right, in a process that should now be familiar to you, we are going to add gathering stitches to the top of our sleeve. So between these two upper notches, you've got lower notches down here, so don't use those ones, use these upper ones, 2 long straight stitches. Now we're going to join the sleeve to the bodice. So lay your bodice out right side facing up, and then you're going to grab your sleeve and lay that down on top of your bodice, right sides together. You're going to pin it in place matching notches. So you have these lower notches that have a single on the front and a double on the back. The single notches will match up on the front arm side, and the double notches will match up on the back. So I like to start pinning by matching notches, and then I pin up towards the center, and then you can repeat that from the other side. And then we are going to, once we have everything in place, we're going to gather it in at the cap. So pull in your gathering stitches till the cap of the sleeve is the same length as the arm side on your bodice. And then you'll just, it's not super full here, but you'll just kind of move those gathers around until they're spaced nicely, pin it in place. Then you'll take this to the sewing machine and you will sew using your 3/8 inch seam allowance all the way along this arm side / sleeve. And you'll repeat that on both sides. Here that is sewn, and now we are going to finish the seam. For the seam finish here, I'm going to use my serger to just do a serged edge. You could do a zigzag stitch that overlaps the edge, or whatever your preferred seam finish method is. Once you have that all finished, you can lay it out flat, and then we're going to press the seam toward the bodice, and you can put a little bit of extra pressing down on the flutter to get it to kind of lay flatter towards the sleeve. Once you're done pressing, you can fold your bodice in half, right sides together, and you're gonna match up this underarm seam and the side seam. These are all gonna get sewn in one go. So you can pin it in place starting at the sleeve hem and working your way down, making sure that the underarm seam is matched up, and then it's down the side seam. And you'll just use a 3/8 inch seam allowance to sew this all in one go. Once you've got that sewn, you're just going to repeat it on both sides and you will finish these seams. After you get that finished, you can give it a little press, and then we're going to flip it wrong side out and work on our sleeve hem. So once you have that in place, you will fold, you already have the creases, but that 1/4 inch folds under, and then it folds under again at that notch. And you can do any, like a little repressing if you need to. And then we're going to take this to the machine and we're going to edge stitch around this sleeve opening, but we're going to leave a little 2-inch opening so that we can run our elastic through. We're at the machine to edge stitch that sleeve hem, and you could pin this, but I live on the wild side and I did not. So you can get it lined up just right under your machine, and you'll just edge stitch around the sleeve hem, but make sure that you leave that little opening for you to run your elastic through. And then after you sew that, you're going to sew another row of stitches parallel to it, 1/2 inch away from the other one. So I just use a ruler to get a point of reference for where on my sewing machine foot or sewing machine a 1/2 inch is. And once I have that lined up, I can see that my stitch is going to kind of go right on the edge of my presser foot. And I will just stitch all the way around the sleeve opening again. And this one, you go all the way around. You don't have to leave an opening. Now that we have our sleeve hem prepped, we're going to add the elastic. So you should have 2 lengths of sleeve hem elastic. The recommended lengths for this elastic is in the beginning of the instructions if you didn't see it. So grab one of those lengths and slap a safety pin on the end, and then we're just going to run this through this little tube that we've created. When the end of the elastic starts to get close to that opening, just set a pin in place to hold it there so it doesn't pull through the tube, and then continue to just inch the elastic all the way through until it comes out the other side. We're going to make sure not to twist the elastic as we pull it through. because that will cause problems when we join it in the loop. When you have both ends pulled through, just overlap them by 1/4 inch and pin them in place, and we'll take that over to the sewing machine to sew it into a loop. So here's the trick for sewing little bits of anything that wants to get sucked down into the feed dog of your sewing machine. Just put a scrap of paper underneath. Ideally like tissue or something thin, but I just honestly used a little chunk of envelope. And then you want to pull your loop out so that you have a little bit of space. And then once you get it under the machine, you can lower your presser foot and then lower your needle and then remove your pin so that nothing slides away from each other. And then you're going to use a zigzag stitch to join your elastic in a loop. And you'll just back stitch a couple times to make sure that that's really secure. And while we're at the sewing machine, we're just going to sew this little bit that we left open shut. So you'll carefully flatten your elastic just by pulling it tight, and then you'll edge stitch that opening shut. Just be careful that your elastic isn't getting caught under your presser foot or under the needle when you do this. And repeat on both sides. And there you have it, cute little ruffle sleeve hems. Okay, we're moving on to the skirt. So we're gonna grab our skirt front H and our pocket facing I, and we will pin them right sides together along these diagonal seams, matching the notches. And you're gonna repeat that on both sides and then use a seam allowance, a 3/8 inch seam allowance to sew down that diagonal seam. Okie smoky, that is done. And now we're just going to open up our pocket facing and press the seam allowance towards the facing, and then we'll understitch by just sewing right next to that last seam on our pocket facing, and this will hold the facing from rolling forward while we're wearing it. Once you've done that on both sides, you will grab your pocket back J, and we are going to pin that right sides together on top of our pocket facing, matching up that long curved edge, and then we'll sew those together using our 3/8 inch seam allowance, and then we will finish that seam, repeat it on both sides, and then meet me back here. Here's that done, so you can see the serged edge looking good. Now we're going to flip the pockets back behind the skirt front, and we'll match up the side seams of the facing, the pocket back, and the skirt at the notch at side seam, and then we'll match it up along the top. We'll match the notches up along the top of the skirt, and then we're going to baste just down the side of the skirt and across the top just to hold the pocket in place, and we'll do that on both sides. And here that is finished. Now we're going to join the front skirt to the back skirt at side seams. So lay them out right sides together, and then we will match up the notches on the side seam, pin those in place, and then you'll use your 3/8 inch seam allowance to sew down the side seams. You'll repeat that on both sides, and then we're going to finish this seam and give it a press. Time to prep the drawstring casing. So using your drawstring casing front piece, you're going to press the straight edge under, the one that doesn't have a notch. You're going to press that under a 1/4 inch and then another 1/4 inch, and then you'll edge stitch this to finish it. And you're going to repeat that on both sides. We're going to join the front and back drawstring casing. So we'll pin those right sides together and sew them along the side seams. To make sure that you've got them lined up right, you want to make sure that the tops are that you have the tops and the bottoms oriented correctly. So the top of the drawstring casing has notches and the bottom does not. So just make sure that you've got top side facing towards the top on the fronts and the backs. Once you have that sewn, just press your seam open. Now that you have those joined together in one long string, you'll just press these side seams open, and then we are going to press the lower edge of the drawstring casing under 1/4 inch all the way around. So you can work your way around the drawstring, just using your seam gauge to check in periodically that you're still just pressing it under 1/4 inch. So now we are going to stitch that drawstring casing to our skirt. To start with, I want to pin it at what I would call the crucial points, matching points on the casing and the skirt. So you have a notch close to the center front of your skirt, and that will be pinned. That's where the end of your drawstring casing gets pinned. Then as you go out a little bit further, there is a double notch that matches with the drawstring casing that matches up, and then the side seam. And then on the back, there's a notch at center back, and then you match the other side seam, the other double notch, and the other single notch. And once you have your crucial spots all lined up, you're gonna go in with a lot of pins, and we're gonna pin around the bottom of this drawstring casing, because that's where we're going to be edge stitching. So I just start placing pins and then work my way all the way around the skirt. And then we're going to take this over to our sewing machine and edge stitch all the way around the drawstring casing, being sure to backstitch at the beginning and end of your stitch. Here is that finished with nice edge stitching on the casing, and now we are going to join the skirt to the bodice. So flip your skirt inside out, and then we'll grab the bodice and we will pin those together, right sides together at the waist seam. Here you're going to be wanting to match up side seams and notches. We're going to sew all the way around this waist seam, and when we do that, we're going to be sewing through our bodice, our drawstring casing, and our skirt. So 3 layers, and we'll use our 3/8 inch seam allowance. After you've sewn the seam, you'll give it a finish and press it, and then we just have a couple more steps. And there is our Davenport finally looking like a dress. Grab 2 of your ruffle piece O's and place them right sides together, matching up the side seams, and then we're going to sew one of the side seams using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Here's that done, and now we're going to grab another ruffle piece and we're going to sew it right sides together to one of the sides. We're creating like a chain here. Now we have a chain of 3 ruffle pieces, and we're just going to sew on that 4th one. So right sides together, we'll pin this last one on and sew down the side seam. Now we have a chain of 4 ruffle pieces, and we're going to join them in a loop. So find the 2 side seams that are still unsewn, and right sides together, we'll pin those together and then stitch. Make sure that your loop is not twisted anywhere along the way. And here's our loop of ruffles. Now we have to finish all 4 of these seams. Now, just like we did with the sleeve and the flutter, we're going to add gathering stitches to this ruffle. We're going to do 2 rows of stitches on each panel, and the reason we're doing separate sets of stitches on each panel is because it'll make it easier to gather in later. So 2 rows of stitches on each panel. Now we're going to pin the ruffle to the skirt of our Davenport. So first we're going to find 4 equal marks along the hem of our skirt. So I'm matching up those side seams to find a center front and a center back, because we have 4 panels on our ruffle, and then we'll have 4 quadrants of our skirt hem. And we'll match those up, and then we will gather it in so that the gathers are distributed evenly. Right sides together, pin your ruffle to the skirt hem, and you're going to pin the side that's getting pinned to the skirt hem is the side that has the gathering stitches. So we're going to match up those quadrants. So you have your 4 ruffles, so you'll pin 1 to the center front, 1 to the side seam, 1 to the center back, and 1 to the other side seam. Now we're going to work one tier of the ruffle at a time. So grab your gathering stitches, the threads, and we're going to pull to gather them in until they match the length of the quadrant of the skirt hem. That sounds like so official, but it's the best way I have to describe it. And then once you have that, you'll kind of distribute the gathers evenly and add some extra pins or clips so that that's held in place for you to sew. And then you're going to work your way around the rest of the skirt so that you're going to do that for each quadrant of the skirt. And this is a little bit tedious, but you know, just get, I don't know, put on a show or something and just make an evening of it. No, I'm kidding. It won't take a whole evening. It will take a little while, but not a whole evening, I promise. Once you have that done, you'll take this over to the sewing machine and you'll sew 3/8 of an inch from the edge all the way around, and just take your time here, making sure as the gathers go under the presser foot that they're not getting, you know, skewed off to the side or crinkled up in some weird way, and just work your way around. After that, you'll finish this seam, and then all we have left is the hem. All right, we've got that ruffle sewn on, we've got the seam finished, and now we are going to prep the hem. So to prep the hem, you will just press the raw edge under 3/8 of an inch, and then you're gonna press it under another 3/8 of an inch. Take it over to the sewing machine and edge stitch that in place, and your Davenport is hemmed. And there is that beautiful hem. Okay, I accidentally lied to you when I said the hem was the last thing we had to do. We have to put the drawstring in. So just grab the drawstring that you made in step 1. You've probably forgotten all about it at this point. But grab that, throw a safety pin on the end, and then we're just gonna inch this through the drawstring casing that we created. And you'll just feed it through slowly. And once it's pulled through the other side, you can kind of work it out so that the two ends of the drawstrings are somewhat even. And then you'll knot each end to keep it from fraying. And your dress is done. Anyway, that is a wrap on the Davenport Dress sew along. I hope that this was helpful or fun for you, and that you make a million Davenport dresses and that they're your favorite dress in the world. Anyway, yeah, like and subscribe if you want to stick around on this channel, and I hope you have a fun week of sewing.